Mafia boss tried to walk away. Then the hospital called about his ex and her newborn twins. Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to my channel. I'm Selena, and tonight I'm inviting you into a world where love and power collide, where pride can blind even the strongest hearts, and where every choice carries consequences heavier than life itself. He never believed the past could stalk a man who built walls as high as his power, but that was the lie he lived inside, one made of glass, polished until it gleamed like gold, and beneath that shine, a fracture waited, invisible, patient, ready to split open the moment he let himself breathe. Lorenzo De Luca, 31, handsome enough to make danger look seductive, had no idea that this morning, the one he thought he controlled, was the morning fate would slip its fingers around his throat. He had no idea what he had already lost. The city stretched beneath his penthouse like a conquered kingdom, all steel and sleepless glitter. Lorenzo stood before the wall of glass, hands in his pockets, suit immaculate, jaw clean-shaven, hair pushed back with that careless precision only a man born to command could pull off. The world listened when he spoke. The world bowed when he moved. Power clung to him the way smoke clings to a lit match, alive, warm, promising destruction at a touch. He exhaled slowly, watching the faint fog of his breath fade on the window. The mornings were the only time he allowed himself silence. No meetings, no family obligations, no blood-soaked decisions disguised as business strategies. Just him, the twilight, and the life he'd built with ruthless discipline. A life without her. He hated that she still crossed his mind in flashes, her laugh soft as rainfall, her perfume warm like vanilla and aching nostalgia, the way her eyes softened even when she was angry. Amelia, his ex-wife, the one person who slipped past every defense he'd ever built, and the one person he forced himself to forget. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. He wasn't a boy anymore. He wasn't the foolish version of himself who believed love could coexist with the throne he sat on. Amelia had wanted freedom, safety, a life free of threats and shadows, a world where the man she loved wasn't also feared by half the city, and he, stubborn, possessive, proud, couldn't give her any of that, so he let her go. Correction. He ordered her out of his life before she could choose to leave on her own. Pride. His most loyal vice. A soft knock echoed from the private elevator entrance. "Enter," Lorenzo said, his voice quiet but carrying the type of command that didn't need volume to dominate. Nico, his right hand, stepped in. "Morning, boss." Lorenzo didn't turn. "Report." It's all routine. Meetings with the Valencia suppliers at 10, security rotation at the docks at 2, and Nico hesitated. Lorenzo finally looked at him. "And?" "A message came in late last night, from someone using a blocked number." The crack in his golden world almost hummed. Lorenzo's voice sharpened. "What did it say?" Nico shifted his weight. "Just one sentence. She's not okay." Silence fell heavy between them. The penthouse, with all its glass and wealth, suddenly felt too exposed. Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but inside him, something cold stirred. Memories clawed their way up, an image of Amelia standing at their kitchen counter in one of his shirts, her quiet smile, the night she left without looking back. "It's a prank," Lorenzo said. "People love games." "Maybe," Nico said carefully, "but the timing, I said it's a prank." Nico shut his mouth. Lorenzo didn't look at him again. Instead, he walked toward the bar, pouring himself a dark, rich espresso. The scent filled the room, bitterness, heat, grounding force. He didn't need distractions, not today, not from the past, not from her. "Delete the message," he said. "Done. Good." But the tightness in Lorenzo's chest didn't ease. He forced the thought away, forced her away. He'd built an empire by knowing what deserved his attention and what didn't. A mysterious message about a woman he had cut from his life meant nothing. She had chosen her path. He had chosen his. Yet, he couldn't shake the echo. She's not okay. He sipped his espresso, irritation sharpening like a blade. Across the city, Amelia would be waking up too, probably in some small apartment or quiet neighborhood she chose to stay hidden in. She wanted distance? She had it. She wanted peace? She traded him for it. So why the hell was someone trying to pull her back into his orbit? Before he could bury the frustration deeper, a second knock came, this one more tentative. "Come in," he called, too curt. Lucia, his cousin, stepped inside. She wasn't one to fear him, which was why her nervous expression instantly put him on alert. "Lorenzo," she said, "you should know something." He didn't have patience for this. "What now?" "It's about Amelia." His grip on the cup tightened just slightly. Lucia continued, "I saw her 2 weeks ago, at the grocery store near the old neighborhood." He didn't want details, didn't need them. But Lucia spoke anyway. She looked tired, pale, not herself. He stared at her, voice lowered. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you still care," she said softly. Lorenzo's glare cut the air. "I don't." Lucia didn't flinch. "You do. Otherwise you wouldn't look like you're trying not to breathe right now." He hated that people who loved him could read him like this. He hated even more that she wasn't wrong. But admitting he cared meant admitting he had made the biggest mistake of his life. And Lorenzo De Luca did not make mistakes. Not out loud. "Stay out of it," he said. "I mean it, Lucia." She hesitated, then nodded and exited silently. The penthouse grew too quiet again. Lorenzo turned back toward the window, letting the city lights blur. He tried to reorder his thoughts, focus on the day ahead, but instead his mind drifted back to Amelia, her last words to him, trembling but determined. "You're choosing the world over us, Lorenzo. One day that world will take everything from you." He had laughed then. Actually laughed, because nothing could touch him. He was untouchable. But now, today, the certainty he once wore like armor felt thinner. A phantom pain pulsed beneath the surface, like a wound he hadn't realized was bleeding. He set the espresso down, untouched. He needed fresh air, distance, anything to drown out the ghosts. But as he walked toward the balcony, his phone vibrated. He almost ignored it. Almost. The screen flashed with a simple notification. Unknown number, one new text. Lorenzo stared at it, breathing once, twice. Then he opened it. Just 4 words waited for him, the same ones Nico mentioned hours earlier, except now the letters seemed carved into his bones. "She's not okay, Lorenzo." His pulse staggered. The crack in his perfect golden world widened, just enough for cold wind to slip through. He should have deleted it. He should have walked away. He should have done anything but what he did next. He reread the message and reread it again. For the first time in a long time, Lorenzo wasn't sure if he still controlled his world or if it was beginning to crumble beneath him. And then his phone rang. Same unknown number. He stared at the screen. As the call started to connect, the ringtone echoed through the penthouse like a pistol shot. Lorenzo's hand hovered over the phone, the polished glass of the balcony railing pressing cold against his palm. Every instinct told him to ignore it. Unknown numbers were traps, distractions, possibly lies. He had survived betrayals, assassins, corrupt cops, and businessmen trying to usurp his empire. One unknown call should not, could not, make him hesitate. And yet, he hesitated. For the first time in years, the world outside his control had reached him, and the sensation was foreign and unsettling. It clutched at his chest with a force he hadn't felt since Amelia. He hadn't expected to feel her ghost here now, after all these carefully orchestrated months of forgetting. And yet the message and the call, simply the existence of her in danger, gnawed at something he refused to name. He pressed the green button. "Hello?" His voice was calm, deceptively so, but there was an edge, a steel-tipped tension that warned the caller not to test him. The line was silent for a heartbeat, long enough for Lorenzo to consider hanging up. Then a voice, soft, tremulous, almost muffled, spoke. "Lorenzo, it's Emilia." The world tilted. The glass of the balcony railing suddenly felt brittle beneath his hands. He wanted to pull the phone away to convince himself that no voice, no word could break the fortress he had built around himself. And yet, the truth struck with the force of inevitability. She wasn't lying. It was her. Emilia. His tone hardened, trying to mask the rapid beating of his heart. "Where are you? What happened?" There was a pause. The faint sound of monitors beeping softly and someone else murmuring under a nurse's breath in the background reached him. I'm in the hospital," she whispered. Her voice trembled. I need you. I don't know. They say the twins. The line went dead. Lorenzo stared at the black screen, a sudden suffocating weight pressing down on his chest. He had been ready to disappear from her life, to erase every memory, every connection that reminded him of softness, of vulnerability. He had thought the finality of their divorce would be enough. But now the universe had thrown her back at him like a grenade, helpless, broken, and connected to him by something he could neither sever nor ignore. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, fingers gripping the arms like claws. He could have walked away. He could have stayed in his golden cage, surrounded by wealth, loyalty, and control. And he almost did. He almost dialed the number to his lawyer to tell him to erase her existence from any legal or personal record. He almost did, but he didn't. Instead, he paced, steps measured, deliberate, each one echoing in the cavernous penthouse. Every step brought him closer to the memory of her smile, her voice, the warmth she carried like a stubborn sun in his frozen world. And with every step, a truth he had buried clawed its way to the surface. He had never stopped caring. He had never stopped loving her. He had only pretended. Lorenzo stopped at the window again, looking down at the streets far below, the city sprawling like a living, breathing organism. He had spent years mastering control. Every movement, every transaction, every whisper in the underworld bent to his will. And yet, here was a situation entirely outside his grasp. Emilia, his ex-wife, in danger, and he unable to protect her until he intervened. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Nico, always vigilant, entered without waiting for an invitation. "Boss?" Nico's voice was careful, knowing the storm brewing inside him. "Are you going to go?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "Do you know what you're asking?" "I'm saying she's in danger. You can fix this. You're the only one who can. Lorenzo held up his hand. "I don't need a reminder." His voice was icy, but inside, his mind raced. He had spent the past months meticulously removing her from his life, pretending that the past was a closed door. He had told himself that power, pride, and control were sufficient substitutes for love, yet that call shattered all certainty. "Then why hesitate?" Nico asked softly. "She's dying, Lorenzo. Don't let pride kill her too." Pride. That one word seared him deeper than any bullet could. He had spent his life letting it guide him, allowing it to dictate his relationships, his decisions, his very humanity. And yet now, it threatened to do exactly what Nico said, to let something irreparable happen, because he refused to bend, to show weakness. He swallowed. His throat felt dry. And then, despite everything, despite every lesson he had imposed on himself, he made a choice. To walk away. He turned to Nico. "Prepare the car, but..." His voice carried a finality that silenced even Nico's concern. "I'm not going." Nico froze. "Not going?" "Boss, "I said I'm not going," Lorenzo repeated. The steel in his voice was enough to silence further argument. He sat back at his desk, leaning into the leather as if the world itself could crush under his weight, and still he would not move. "She's not my responsibility anymore. I've moved on." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. He hated their truth. He hated their falsehood. And deep down, he knew it was a lie he was telling not to her, but to himself. Meanwhile, across the city, Amelia clutched the hospital bed's railing, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the soft, rhythmic beeping of machines, grounding her in a reality she hadn't dared imagine. The labor had been excruciating, the twins fragile, each breath she took a battle. And yet, even as exhaustion threatened to collapse her, she reached for her phone, hoping beyond hope that Lorenzo would answer, that he would hear her, that he would care enough to come. She had waited years, silently, watching the man she once loved build walls around his heart that not even she could penetrate. And now, with blood, pain, and the cries of new life surrounding her, she realized the cruelest truth. Those walls were more formidable than she had imagined. Her hand trembled as she dialed again. The line rang, carrying her desperation across the distance to a man who had chosen pride over love. She whispered their shared history into the phone, fragments of memory, fragments of pain, and then silence. Back in the penthouse, Lorenzo stared at the empty phone screen. The room was silent again, the city indifferent. He sipped his espresso, savoring the bitterness as a shield, a reminder that control was still possible. He told himself it was enough. He told himself she would survive. He told himself he had no responsibility, and for a moment the world seemed to agree. But pride, as it often does, is a fragile armor. Hours later, Nico returned. Urgency in his steps. "Boss," he said, voice low but strained. "It's worse than we thought. The hospital. Something's happening. They're calling again. It's not stable." Lorenzo's hand paused mid-air, coffee cup trembling slightly. "What do you mean, not stable?" "They said—" Nico hesitated, unsure how to phrase what came next. "They said if you don't get here, now, it might be too late." A cold, unfamiliar sensation gripped Lorenzo's chest. Pride, stubborn and ironclad, now felt like a chain around his throat. He had chosen to walk away. He had chosen to ignore the call, and yet the world demanded that he act, and act fast. He set the cup down, staring out at the city that had always bowed to him, feeling the weight of a truth he had refused to face. He might be powerless after all. The phone rang again, same unknown number. His instincts screamed to ignore it, and yet he answered. "Lorenzo," a nurse's voice said, sharp and trembling, "you need to come. She—" Before the words could finish, the line went dead. Lorenzo's fist smashed against the desk. Pride and control, his lifelong companions, were useless now. The truth he had avoided, denied, and rejected pressed against him with terrifying clarity. Amelia was in danger, the twins were in danger, and he had done nothing. He had walked away. And now, the consequences were coming for him. The rain came suddenly, as if the city itself had sensed the collapse looming over Amelia's fragile world. Water hammered the hospital windows in jagged rhythms, tapping like the frantic heartbeat of the woman struggling inside. She lay on the sterile bed, body trembling with exhaustion. Sweat mingling with tears as she clutched one of the tiny, fragile forms of her newborn twins. The other slept in an incubator, monitored by machines whose soft beeps had become the lullaby of her growing panic. She was alone. Every nurse on duty moved with clinical precision, but the kind of touch, the kind of reassurance that only he, Lorenzo, had ever provided, was absent. Every second stretched into eternity, and the ache in her chest deepened with the knowledge that he had walked away, that he had chosen pride over presence, over love, over her. The monitors flickered once, then again, as if echoing her internal tremor. A soft cry erupted from one of the twins. Emilia's hands shook as she leaned closer, whispering soothing words into tiny ears that had only known the harshness of the world for hours. Her own heart raced, a drum against ribs that felt too fragile for her weight. "It's okay, my love. Stay with me," she breathed, as much to herself as to the child. Outside the hospital, Lorenzo remained suspended in his penthouse, staring at the phone like it had betrayed him. He had ignored the first call, ignored the first warning, ignored the first plea, and now the weight of inaction pressed on him with the inevitability of gravity. Each second he delayed, the past he had so meticulously boxed away clawed at the walls of his mind. He paced, unable to reconcile the image of Emilia, his Emilia struggling without him. Pride had been his armor, his shield against vulnerability, but now it felt brittle, like glass that could shatter under the slightest pressure. Nico's warning replayed in his mind, each word sharpening the tension in his chest. If you don't get here, it might be too late. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, the situation intensified. Emilia's breathing grew shallow as her body protested the labor, the after-effects of trauma, and sheer fatigue. Her fingers clenched the hospital sheets as she forced herself to stay awake, to remain vigilant over the twins' fragile lives. Her mind raced with visions of him, Lorenzo, arriving too late, his fury at her survival, the tension between past love and present danger colliding in a perfect storm of emotion. She wanted to call him, to scream his name, to beg him for help, but even her own voice seemed to falter under the weight of exhaustion. The nurse returned, clipboard in hand, face pale beneath the harsh hospital lights. "Ma'am, we need to stabilize her immediately. Blood pressure dropping, heart rate fluctuating. The twins. We need to act fast." Emilia's eyes widened. Panic flared, hot and insistent. "Do it! Do whatever you have to do," she cried, her voice raw, breaking under strain. Just don't let them. Her words dissolved into a sob. Her body convulsed as a wave of dizziness swept over her, forcing her down into the bed. One tiny hand reached out, clutching her wrist, and she whispered apologies she wasn't sure who were for. Herself, the twins, or the man she still loved, despite every rejection he had given. Back in the penthouse, Lorenzo finally made a decision. He grabbed his coat, his mind a storm of suppressed memories and jagged fear. Each step toward the elevator echoed like a drumbeat of impending reckoning. He had ignored warnings long enough. Ignoring them further would be catastrophic. Nico fell into step behind him, silent but watchful, sensing the shift in his boss's demeanor. The streets blurred beneath the rain, lights refracting like fractured glass on the slick asphalt as Lorenzo's car cut through the city. Each turn, each blink seemed to stretch time, elongating his sense of helplessness. He had always been untouchable. No man, no threat, no conspiracy had ever shaken him this way. And yet the thought that he might reach the hospital too late made every breath taste like iron. Inside the hospital, Emilia's perspective shifted to desperation. She watched the monitors flash erratically, the red line dipping, rising, dipping again, like a wave threatening to swallow her whole. Nurses moved with urgency. Doctors barked orders, but every second she feared that his absence, his refusal, would render all efforts meaningless. Every thought circled back to the man she had once trusted with her life. The man whose pride now threatened to undo everything she had survived. A twin cried out, shrill and insistent, and Emilia pressed herself closer, trying to comfort both at once. She whispered, half prayer, half command, "Stay with me, please. Stay with me." Her voice cracked under the strain, as fragile as the infants in their incubators. And then, an unexpected complication. One of the monitors screamed a warning, red lights flashing with harsh insistence. A nurse shouted, "Critical! Baby 2! Oxygen saturation dropping!" Amelia's chest constricted, panic overtaking every rational thought. She reached desperately for the nurse, trembling hands gripping a sterile sleeve. "Do something, please, do something now!" Simultaneously, Lorenzo's car skidded slightly on a wet turn. Rain lashed his face through the open window. Mingling with sweat and a cold dread that refused to dissipate, Nico's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "Almost there," he said quietly. But even Nico's reassurance felt hollow, swallowed by the gravity of what Lorenzo imagined waiting for him inside. Inside, the chaos escalated. Nurses and doctors worked frantically to stabilize the twins, and Amelia, each movement precise yet urgent, each breath measured yet desperate. Amelia clutched the side of the bed, her own pulse racing in sync with the monitors, her mind a storm of fear and longing. She wanted to scream, to call him again, but the hospital line had already rung unanswered too many times. The walls of her world felt like they were closing in, oppressive and suffocating. And in that moment, as Lorenzo's car hurtled toward the hospital, both perspectives collided in the invisible web of tension. Amelia, helpless, clinging to life and love. Lorenzo, unstoppable in motion, yet frozen in the gnawing fear of arriving too late. Then a sudden alarm rang throughout the neonatal wing, a siren that shattered the fragile rhythm of the room. The red lights cast jagged shadows across walls, incubators, and the faces of exhausted medical staff. A doctor shouted, "We need immediate intervention! Baby 2, stat!" Amelia felt her body weaken, nearly collapsing under the emotional and physical strain. She reached for her phone once more, hands shaking, dialing him again, her voice hoarse but determined. "Lorenzo, please answer me." Her words lingered in the empty corridor. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring stretched like an eternity, amplifying every heartbeat, every gasp of air, every tremor of despair. And then, before he could pick up, before the next breath could be drawn, one of the incubators flatlined. The shrill sound of the alarm cut through the sterile air like a dagger. Nurses and doctors shouted over one another, panic replacing urgency, chaos overtaking order. Amelia froze, staring at the monitor with wide, unblinking eyes. Time seemed to stop. Lorenzo's car skidded to a halt in the rain, tires screeching against the asphalt. He jumped out, coat drenched, water sliding down his face, mixing with sweat and an unfamiliar, raw terror. His chest tightened. Pride had failed him. Control had failed him. He was powerless, and every instinct screamed that he was too late. And as he ran through the hospital doors, rain dripping off his hair and suit, the echo of the alarm followed him, red, piercing, undeniable, a herald of the nightmare he had tried so desperately to avoid. Inside, Amelia's head lolled to the side, exhaustion and fear making her almost collapse. One of the nurses grabbed her shoulder, steadying her. "She's losing consciousness," a voice shouted, and in that instant Lorenzo arrived at the neonatal wing, only to be met with the most horrifying sight of his life. One of his newborn twins was unresponsive, the machine screaming, and Amelia slumped at the side of the bed, her strength spent, her hope hanging by a thread. The fluorescent lights of the neonatal wing cast long, cold shadows across the polished floors, reflecting every panic-stricken movement, every whispered command, every soft sob that slipped past Amelia's trembling lips. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear, sterile yet suffocating. Lorenzo's boots clattered across the corridor, the sound echoing off walls lined with the hum of machines. His eyes, dark and stormy, scanned the room, drinking in every chaotic detail. Doctors leaning over incubators, nurses shuffling monitors and oxygen tubes, the cries of newborns punctuating the sterile silence of desperation. Amelia's world had narrowed to the single red alarm that had shattered the fragile rhythm of her existence. Every thought, every beat of her heart was consumed by the twin that had stopped breathing. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the lifeless form, pressing her palm against the tiny chest in a futile attempt to bring warmth, life, hope. But the baby remained motionless, a silent accusation against the man who had chosen pride over presence, the man whose absence had allowed this nightmare to unfold. And then Lorenzo entered. Time fractured into sharp shards. One moment he was running through the rain-soaked streets, heart hammering with fear and self-recrimination. The next, he was standing in the threshold of the wing, every sinew taut with urgency and dread. The golden armor of the Mafia boss, the carefully constructed walls of pride and control, dissolved instantly under the intensity of the scene before him. His gaze locked on Amelia, pale and trembling, clinging desperately to the tiny, fragile body of one of their twins. Her hair, damp and matted with sweat, fell over her face, shadows of exhaustion etched in every line. Lorenzo's chest constricted, a rush of guilt and longing so fierce it threatened to choke him. Every instinct screamed to reach for her, to gather her into his arms, to protect, to soothe, to undo the hours he had squandered in absence. But the nurses were between them, a barrier of authority and sterile procedure, and Lorenzo knew that in this room even he could not impose his will with the force of power alone. Control here was meaningless. "Step back," one of the doctors barked, voice sharp with urgency. "We need room!" Lorenzo froze, hands clenching at his sides. The pride that had once guided every move, that had forced him to abandon her for the illusion of power, now trembled under the weight of helplessness. He wanted to leap across the space, to seize control, but the rules of life and death, of fragility, of existence itself, would not bend for him. Amelia's eyes flickered up, meeting his. For a moment, time itself held its breath. Recognition, relief, and fury mingled in her gaze. "You're here," she whispered, barely audible. Her voice was soft, trembling, but it cut through the chaos with a precision that pierced Lorenzo's chest. "Why did you wait?" He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Words failed him. Pride, always his armor, had no power here. Only fear and the gnawing certainty that he might be too late. A nurse shouted, "Oxygen's dropping! We need emergency intervention now!" Amelia's hands shook as the staff worked frantically, tiny instruments moving like extensions of their own precise, anxious wills. Lorenzo reached out instinctively, hand hovering near her shoulder, torn between interference and restraint. He felt every second stretch, every heartbeat magnified, and then a doctor snapped at him, "Sir, please, step back." He obeyed, though the obedience tasted like fire in his mouth. His eyes never left the scene. Amelia, fragile and resolute, the twins, precariously hanging between life and death, the alarm screaming like the final judgment he had ignored for too long. The moments dragged into what felt like hours. Lorenzo's mind replayed every decision, every refusal, every cold, calculated choice he had made that had led to this point. Pride, he realized, had been a luxury he could no longer afford. Each second he had withheld care, each mile he had hesitated to drive, each warning he had ignored now pressed against him with devastating clarity. This was the point of no return. Meanwhile, Amelia's perspective flickered between desperation and resignation. She could feel the tiny life against her chest, fragile, fleeting, every gasp of breath, a battle against inevitability. Her body trembled. Not only from exhaustion, but from the tension of fear. Fear of losing the man who had abandoned her. Fear of losing the children she had brought into the world alone. Fear of the unrelenting cruelty of circumstance. And then the alarm shifted, the red line quivering, the tiny numbers flashing in warning. A doctor called out for immediate resuscitation. Nurses scrambled, and Amelia's fingers tightened around the blanket, pulling herself closer, tears streaming freely now, unrestrained, bitter. Lorenzo's hand itched to intervene. Every instinct screamed to override protocol, to reach, to take, to command. But he understood. Control was not possible here, and the realization tore at him more fiercely than any bullet could. The Mafia boss, the man who bent worlds to his will, was powerless before the fragility of life. He thought of the message he had ignored, of the calls he had refused, of the minutes and hours squandered in arrogance, in pride. His chest ached with the knowledge that every choice had led to this precipice, a cliff over which there was no return. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside. Rain hammered the windows, splashing against glass panels, dripping down onto the sterile floors, carrying with it the echo of missed chances and potential devastation. Lightning flashed, illuminating Lorenzo's tense figure, every detail of the penthouse and streets now irrelevant. All that existed was the room, the fragile life, the woman who had once held his heart. Amelia's vision blurred as she watched the doctors' faces twist with urgency. One of the nurses turned to her, voice strained. "We're going to do everything we can, ma'am, but we need to know if you're able to step back. She needs you steady, calm. The baby's oxygen saturation is dangerously low." "Step back?" Amelia whispered, voice cracking. "Step back? How can I step back when my children, my life, hangs on this moment?" Lorenzo's lips pressed into a hard line. He could feel the weight of every choice pressing down, threatening to crush him under guilt and fear. The person he had been, cold, controlled, untouchable, was gone, replaced by a man whose pulse matched the frantic alarm of life itself. A sudden shift. One of the twins twitched, a shallow, fleeting breath. A nurse called out for immediate monitoring. Amelia clutched the tiny form, whispering encouragement, prayers, promises she didn't fully believe she deserved to make. Lorenzo's chest heaved. Relief, bitter and sharp. Cut through the storm of fear, but it was fleeting. He knew the delicate balance of life was not yet secured. Every second counted. Every misstep could be catastrophic. And then, the call he had tried to ignore earlier came again. The phone rang with that familiar, unknown number. His hand hesitated above the device. Pride screamed at him to silence it. Fear screamed at him to answer. He picked up, voice low and controlled, trying to regain some semblance of his former self. "Lorenzo De Luca," a nurse's urgent voice said, trembling. "Your ex-wife. She's deteriorating fast. You need to be here immediately, or we may not—" The line went dead before the warning could finish. The click echoed in the corridor, like the snap of fate itself. Lorenzo froze, a cold, paralyzing realization gripping him. He had arrived too late in action, too slow in attention. The line between life and death, hope and despair, was thinning, and he was still standing on the wrong side. He glanced at Amelia, who had not yet noticed him in the doorway, absorbed in the fragile miracle of her children. She was unaware of the near catastrophe, unaware that the moments she had clung to for life had almost slipped beyond saving. But Lorenzo knew, and the weight of that knowledge was suffocating. He stepped closer, boots echoing on the linoleum, every movement deliberate, careful, desperate. He could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the tension in her hands as she balanced hope and despair. Every second he had lost, every choice made in arrogance and pride, now screamed at him with merciless clarity. And then, a sudden alarm, louder, sharper than before, pierced the room. One of the monitors blared red, the sound cutting through Lorenzo's very bones. The doctor shouted, "Baby 2, critical! We need intervention now!" Amelia froze, wide-eyed, clutching her child, tears blinding her. Lorenzo lunged forward, but before he could reach her, before he could act, another nurse appeared, gripping his arm. "Sir, you cannot." And in that split second, the fragile line of life wavered, the machine's red light flashing an almost accusatory rhythm, and Lorenzo understood with gut-wrenching clarity. He had crossed the point of no return. The city outside raged, rain lashing against the hospital windows like the echoes of a storm inside Lorenzo himself. His chest heaved, adrenaline and guilt battling in an unrelenting war. Every instinct screamed to act, to move, to save, to claim control over this crisis he had ignored for too long. Yet as he stood in the sterile corridor, something cold and inflexible hardened in him. Pride. He had built his empire on control, on unwavering authority, on the certainty that no one, not even fate, could dictate his actions. And yet, here he was, helpless, vulnerable, exposed by a truth he had long denied. Amelia, the woman he had abandoned, teetered between life and death with the twins in her fragile grip, and he could not act. A nurse, voice trembling with urgency, gripped his arm. "Sir, please, your presence is needed immediately in the NICU. One of the babies is critical." Lorenzo's eyes snapped toward the room. He saw her then, Amelia, pale and trembling, desperately holding one of the twins. Her fingers were white-knuckled around the blanket, and tears streamed down her face unchecked. The other twin lay in an incubator, machines screaming in alarm. He felt the familiar surge, the desire to leap, to reach, to fix what he had ignored. But something inside him recoiled. Pride whispered razor sharp, "You will not bend. You will not be the man who arrives at the last moment. You are not weak." Nico, standing behind him, exhaled sharply. "Boss, we can't wait. They need you. She's losing it. You need to step in." Lorenzo turned slowly, voice low and dangerous. "I am here, Nico. That is enough." Nico's jaw tightened, frustration cutting his calm. "Enough? Boss, they could—" "I said enough," Lorenzo interrupted, tone final. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, fixed on the nurses and doctors as though sheer will alone could bend reality. He would not allow himself to be manipulated by circumstance, by emotion, by the pleas of others, even if that meant standing idly while life teetered on the edge. Inside the room, Amelia's awareness flickered between panic and delirium. Every heartbeat, every shriek of the monitors, every cry from the tiny lungs of her newborns was a drum of terror pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to beg, to call him, to demand that he intervene. But the cold shadow of his absence had already taught her the futility of hope. "Lorenzo," she whispered under her breath, as if speaking aloud could summon him closer. "Please, I need you." But he remained frozen, a statue of wealth, power, and self-imposed detachment. A doctor shouted, "Ma'am, we need to stabilize both babies now. Step back and let us work." Amelia shook her head violently, tears blurring her vision. "No, I can't step back. They need me." Machines beeped faster, alarms screaming in discordant chorus, and Amelia's hands trembled violently as she pressed them against the tiny chest of one twin, willing life into it with sheer desperation. Lorenzo watched, chest tight, but pride anchored him. To intervene now would mean acknowledging weakness, admitting that his absence had consequences, admitting that he had failed, and he could not. He could not. Across the room, Nico shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing disaster, knowing that even his loyalty and skill could not compensate for the man's stubborn refusal. He had tried to warn him, to guide him, to appeal to reason and love, but Lorenzo had shut out every voice, every warning, every plea. Minutes stretched like hours. The monitor blared, red digits flickering with the fragile pulse of life. Amelia's chest rose and fell unevenly, body trembling, drenched in sweat. Pale as the sterile sheets beneath her, one twin gasped, fragile as a whisper, while the other remained motionless, an unyielding void. And then As if testing the limits of fate, another call came through. Lorenzo's phone, vibrating insistently in his hand. The unknown number again. He glared at it, fury and pride entwined. He pressed it to his ear, voice low and controlled. "Yes?" "Lorenzo," the nurse's voice said, sharp and panicked. "You need to come now. Your ex-wife is deteriorating. Baby two's condition. It's critical. You must—" The line clicked dead before the sentence could finish. Lorenzo's eyes darkened, jaw tightening. Pride, ever his constant companion, whispered one last argument. "You will not bend. You will not be the man who arrives too late. You are above failure." And with a cruel, ironclad certainty, he destroyed the phone, pressing it against the marble counter until it shattered under the force of his fist. Nico exhaled sharply, a silent mixture of fear and frustration. Lorenzo didn't speak. He turned, walking toward the elevator with deliberate, measured steps, as if leaving the hospital entirely would somehow preserve his control. He did not notice the urgency in the room, the panic etched into the faces of the staff, the frailty of the tiny life hanging in balance, or the silent screams of Emilia's soul. Emilia felt her chest tighten. Her head swam with fatigue and fear. Every muscle screamed in exhaustion, every thought twisted with desperation. The twin in her arms gasped, a flicker of life returning briefly, and then silence. Her hand shook violently, clutching the tiny body. "No, no, no, no," she whispered. The sound was almost a prayer, almost a scream, almost nothing. Her vision blurred, tears streaming unchecked. She realized with the sickening clarity of despair that she was alone. He had chosen pride over presence. He had refused. And now, the consequences were arriving faster than she could breathe. The monitors beeped erratically, red digits flashing with a cruel insistence. The room, once filled with controlled urgency, now teetered on chaos. A nurse cried out, a doctor barked orders, and Emilia's mind fractured under the weight of fear. She pressed herself closer to the twin in her arms, whispering desperate words, hoping against hope that they might be enough. Outside, Lorenzo paused in the elevator, knuckles white on the rail. He felt the vibration of panic in the city, the weight of consequence pressing against him. Pride had always guided him, had always protected him, but now it felt like chains. And yet he would not step back. He would not acknowledge weakness. He would not face the unbearable truth of what he had allowed by refusing to act. And as the elevator descended, the storm outside mirrored the storm inside, the world indifferent to the consequences of a man who thought himself untouchable. Inside the room, a nurse shouted, "We need emergency intervention. Baby 2 is—" A sudden silence. Emilia froze, heart pounding, mind suspended in terror. She looked down at the tiny form in her arms, chest rising and falling slower than before, every breath a battle. Her tears soaked the blanket as her body shook uncontrollably. The incubator for the other twin flashed red, alarms screaming, but in this room of chaos there was only her, the fragile life she cradled, and the absence of the man who could have made the difference. And then a shadow fell over the room. She looked up, voice cracking with hope and fury. "Lorenzo!" He was there. But the sight that greeted him, the monitors screaming, her trembling, the delicate life hanging by a thread, cut deeper than any failure he had faced before. And as he stepped forward, hands outstretched, he realized the devastating truth. Pride had not saved him. It had nearly destroyed everything. Lorenzo's boots clicked against the cold hospital floor as he moved, but every step felt like moving through thick fog. The sterile lights above reflected in the sweat on his brow, the tension coiling in his shoulders, the guilt that pressed on him like a physical weight. He reached Emilia's side, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to see the consequences of his pride. She looked up at him, eyes wide and glistening, fingers trembling as they clutched the tiny, fragile form of one twin. The other lay in the incubator, monitors screaming in desperate cadence, red digits flashing as if marking the seconds of life and death. He knelt beside her, careful not to disrupt the frantic flow of the nurses and doctors. "Emilia?" he said softly, voice trembling despite the facade of control. "I'm here. I'm here." Her eyes flickered between relief and anger. "Where were you?" Her voice was a whisper, broken by exhaustion, fear, and rage. You ignored the calls. You ignored everything. I know," Lorenzo interrupted, voice tight. He could feel his own chest constricting under the pressure of all he had refused to admit. Pride, once his armor, now felt like a chain, binding him as he realized the cost of every choice he had made. I should have come sooner. I failed." The words were uncharacteristic. They slipped past the walls of control, past the steel he had built around himself. In their absence, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never known. Emilia's eyes softened, just slightly, but fear still laced her features. "It's not just you who failed," she whispered. "It's both of us. Or maybe it's the world that's failing us." The nurse beside them barked orders again. "We need to intubate baby too. Blood pressure dropping, heart rate unstable. Mom, I need you to stay still." Emilia nodded weakly, hands shaking violently, pressing herself closer to the tiny life. Lorenzo placed a hand over hers, grounding, steadying, giving what control he could. He had spent his life wielding power over men, over cities, over death itself. But now he realized control was meaningless here. Power meant nothing in the face of fragile life, of desperate need, of mortality that did not care who he was. Time slowed to unbearable increments. Each second was a razor cutting through their world. The twin in Emilia's arms gasped weakly, tiny chest rising and falling with shallow desperation. The monitors screamed louder, alarms piercing, cutting through the fragile rhythm of hope. Emilia's mind teetered on the edge of collapse. Every muscle screamed in exhaustion, every thought splintered into fear and regret. She clung to the life in her arms, whispering prayers she didn't believe she deserved to speak. Her body trembled violently, sweat mixing with tears, every heartbeat a reminder of the fragility that surrounded them. Lorenzo tightened his hand over hers. "We'll get through this," he said, though even he questioned the words. Hope felt fragile, tentative, and yet it was all he had to offer. A doctor barked for emergency intervention. Nurses moved with frantic precision, but even their skill could not erase the tension, could not guarantee the fragile line between survival and catastrophe. The second twin's monitor flatlined for a horrifying heartbeat. Silence. Then alarms erupted anew. Emilia gasped, clutching the twin to her chest, eyes wide with terror. No, please, stay with me." Lorenzo felt a surge of panic unlike anything he'd experienced in his life. Every street, every empire, every calculated threat had never touched him like this. Fear, raw and unfiltered, gripped him. He knelt, eyes blazing, heart hammering. "Stay, please stay," he whispered, voice breaking, not to the child, not to Emilia, but to fate itself. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rolling like the heartbeat of the universe. Lorenzo could feel the electricity in the air, a mirrored reflection of the chaos in the room. He just knew that every second wasted, every moment of refusal could be the difference between life and death. Emilia's fingers shook violently. "Lorenzo, you have to do something." Her voice cracked, raw and desperate. "You have to save them." He could not in the way he wanted. Power meant nothing here. Commands meant nothing. Money, influence, even fear, all were useless. Only presence, only only action, only unflinching courage could save them now. And yet, as the medical team worked frantically, a hand on her shoulder, a whispered encouragement, Lorenzo felt the crushing weight of failure press down. Pride had anchored him in the wrong place. Delay had magnified danger, and every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of life in the tiny body clung to him with the silent accusation of what he had refused to be. The twins' monitors quivered violently. The red digits oscillated, threatening to dip below the threshold of survival. Amelia's knees buckled, body trembling violently, and Lorenzo caught her, steadying her against the chaos. He whispered into her ear, voice hoarse with desperation, "I'm here. I won't leave. I promise." The nurses barked over him, moving around with urgency, but he felt the sting of impotence. Even now, as he was present, he was powerless to control the outcome. Every second was an agonizing negotiation with death itself. And then, a sudden complication. One of the twins stopped moving entirely. The alarm screamed like a banshee in the night, echoing off the sterile walls, tearing through Lorenzo's chest. He leaned closer, desperate, hands trembling as he touched the tiny form. Amelia's sobs rose, uncontrolled, tearing from her throat. "No, no, not like this." The doctor shouted commands. Nurses moved, machines beeped. Lorenzo could only watch, powerless, as life and death danced on a knife's edge. His mind raced, a storm of calculation, guilt, and dread. Every choice he had made, every second he had delayed, every refusal fueled this moment of desperation. And then, a flash of memory, unbidden. Amelia's voice, soft and trembling, years ago. "One day, Lorenzo, the world will take everything from you if you don't protect the ones you love." It struck him now with the brutal clarity of prophecy. Pride had blinded him. Ego had frozen him in inaction. And now, the consequence of his refusal loomed larger than any empire he had ever commanded. He leaned closer, whispering into the chaos, "I won't lose you, not now, not ever." But the storm, the alarms, the fragile lives, the exhaustion, they all conspired against him. The twin in his arms gasped weakly, then stilled. The incubator flashed red, alarms shrieking, and Amelia's body went rigid, trembling with exhaustion and terror. The room became a vortex of chaos, of fear, of desperate hope. Lorenzo's mind screamed at him, voice of conscience and love intertwined. "Act! Act! You cannot fail now!" He stepped forward, willing everything he had, every ounce of power, every shred of courage, every piece of his soul, toward the impossible task of keeping life tethered to these tiny bodies. And then, the monitors flatlined simultaneously. Amelia screamed, a sound raw and shattering as the life she had nurtured for hours hung by a thread. Lorenzo froze, chest constricting, mind breaking under the weight of impossibility. He had arrived. He was present, and yet he had failed. The world tilted, time fractured, and the storm outside mirrored the chaos inside. One twin lay still, the other fought weakly. Amelia's sobs racked her body, and Lorenzo, for the first time in his life, realized that even he could not control everything. The rain had slowed, leaving a wet, heavy stillness over the city, but inside the hospital, the air was thick with panic, the scent of antiseptic and fear so potent it made Lorenzo's chest ache. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to act, to save, to undo the minutes he had squandered, but even as he hovered over Amelia and the twins, the truth hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He had no control. Not really. Not over this. He looked down at the fragile form of one twin, eyes half-lidded, struggling to breathe, and at the other, flatlined. Machines wailing like a funeral dirge. The chaos of alarms, of shouted commands, of nurses moving with surgical precision, all blurred into a single, unbearable reality. Life and death were dancing, and he had been absent when it mattered most. Amelia's head lolled back against the edge of the bed, eyes glazed, lips parted in shallow, uneven breaths. Her fingers were still clutching the surviving twin, trembling violently. She was awake, aware, terrified, but utterly exhausted, teetering on the edge of consciousness. "Lorenzo, please," she whispered, barely audible. Her voice cracked, a splintering of raw emotion. "Help! Them help us!" He wanted to scream. He wanted to shake the world until it bowed to his will. He wanted to bend reality itself to save her, to save them. But the machines, the alarms, the sterile hum of the hospital, all reminded him of a bitter truth. His pride, his arrogance, his refusal to act sooner had led them here. And now he was racing against consequences he had almost authored himself. He staggered back, feeling nausea and despair coiling together. How could a man who had commanded fear, loyalty, and death itself be powerless in the face of life? He had ignored the first call. He had refused the second. He had destroyed the phone instead of listening. And now he was too late, or nearly. Then, amidst the chaos, a message pinged on a hospital tablet left carelessly on a counter. Lorenzo's attention snapped. He grabbed it, eyes scanning the words, and everything inside him froze. It was from Dr. Venturi, the neonatal specialist, and it contained lab results, updates on both twins, and something more. Something he hadn't expected. Something that shook him to his core. The surviving twin, fragile though it was, had a rare congenital condition. Without immediate specialized intervention, it would be fatal. The other twin, whose monitors had just flatlined, was stable, but only because emergency measures had been performed at a precise window. If he had arrived 5 minutes later, she would have been lost. Lorenzo's fingers trembled over the tablet. He realized with sickening clarity that Amelia had not only faced the trauma of childbirth alone, but had fought against death and failure without him. And she had succeeded, barely, because of the skill of strangers and despite the void his pride had carved. His chest tightened, guilt and horror coiling like a snake inside him. He had underestimated the fragility of the world he thought he could command. Pride had blinded him. Ego had paralyzed him, and the truth, now illuminated in harsh, unforgiving clarity, left him raw and exposed. Amelia's eyes flicked toward him, voice weak, trembling. You know." He swallowed, voice hoarse. I see it now. I should have what?" Her tone was soft but sharp, cutting through him like a blade. "You weren't there. You didn't care enough. I almost lost them. The words faltered. Her gaze dropped to the surviving twin, trembling chest rising and falling with fragile persistence. I couldn't let them die, Lorenzo. Not without you, not with you. Gone." Lorenzo's hands clenched into fists, nails biting into palms. The full weight of his mistakes pressed down like a physical force. Pride had driven him to refusal. Arrogance had led him to destroy the phone that could have guided him. Every moment he had delayed, every choice he had made in ego, had nearly cost them their lives. He felt sick. Humiliation, fear, and grief collided inside him. A storm more powerful than any he had commanded in the streets, more devastating than any betrayal he had endured. And yet, in the corner of the room, he glimpsed something he had not expected: Amelia's determination. Despite exhaustion, despite trauma, despite the near collapse of life around her, she had fought. She had protected the twins with nothing but sheer will, instinct, and courage. And she had survived. And they had survived. Lorenzo sank into a chair, shoulders slumping. Pride, that insidious armor, had failed him. Ego had betrayed him. And he knew, painfully, that words alone could never repair the damage he had done. And then a nurse appeared, breathless, clutching a clipboard. "Dr. De Luca," she said, voice trembling. There's something else. Something you need to know about the twins. It's urgent." Lorenzo rose instantly, chest tightening. "What is it?" The nurse glanced around as if afraid to speak the truth aloud. She took a deep breath. "Baby too. She's not just healthy. There's a complication. Blood work shows they're not normal. There's something extraordinary, something genetic, something we've never seen before. The twins, they're unique." Amelia's head tilted, confused, fear mingling with exhaustion. "Unique?" "Yes," the nurse said, voice barely above a whisper. "They're markers. It's unprecedented. They might survive things. Others wouldn't. Their resilience, it's almost impossible to explain. But it's real. We don't understand it fully yet, but..." Lorenzo's heart skipped. His hands clenched. The twins, the very children he had refused to protect, were remarkable, extraordinary, miraculous. And yet, they were still dependent on him, still fragile, still at risk. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been blind, arrogant, and proud. He had nearly let the only things he had ever truly loved be lost. And now, knowing their uniqueness, the weight of responsibility crushed him. Pride, ego, control, none of it mattered. Only action, only presence, only sacrifice could protect them now. He turned to Amelia, eyes dark with fear and determination. I have to fix this," he said, voice low and urgent. "I can't let them suffer. I failed already. I won't let it happen again." Her gaze met his, and for the first time in hours, she saw something more than power. She saw humility. She saw fear. She saw regret. She saw a man willing to risk everything he had, willing to be vulnerable, willing to act. And yet, before he could reach for her, before he could intervene in the delicate balance of life and death, the monitors on the surviving twin began to spike violently. The alarms screamed anew, shrill and relentless, echoing through the ward. Doctors shouted, nurses scrambled, and Amelia's hands trembled violently as she clutched the tiny body. Lorenzo lunged forward, chest pounding, voice raw. "Hold on, don't leave me!" But the truth, the full scope of the crisis, the consequences of his pride, was still unfolding. And as the alarms shrieked louder, the nurse glanced at Lorenzo with wide eyes, voice trembling. "Boss, we might not be able to save both of them." The word struck him like a knife. He froze. Amelia's sobs cut through the chaos, heart-wrenching and desperate. And in that instant, Lorenzo understood fully the cost of pride, the consequences of delay, and the impossible weight of love he had refused to acknowledge until it was almost too late. Life, fragile and miraculous, hung by the slimmest thread, and he could not fail them again. The hospital was alive with tension, the alarms a relentless chorus of urgent life and death decisions. Lorenzo sprinted through the corridor, every muscle taut, every heartbeat hammering with desperation. Rain still streaked the windows outside, casting a silver sheen over the sterile tile floors. Each echoing footstep felt like a countdown, a reminder that he could not undo the past, only act with the remaining seconds he had. Inside the neonatal wing, Amelia hovered over the surviving twin, trembling, her body barely able to hold itself upright. Her eyes, wide and haunted, flicked to Lorenzo as he appeared at the doorway, coat soaked, hair plastered to his head. He did not stop, did not hesitate. He crossed the room in a few strides, hands outstretched, and this time he did not wait. "Give me her," he commanded, voice low but firm, the same voice that had once ruled cities, now bent by urgency and fear. Amelia hesitated for only a moment, then let the child slip into his arms. He held her delicately, chest heaving, sweat and rain mixing on his brow. The alarms were still screaming, but he could feel the rhythm of life pulsing beneath his fingers, a fragile, miraculous pulse he would protect at any cost. The doctors barked orders, moving with surgical precision, but Lorenzo's presence changed the dynamic. He no longer wielded power as arrogance. He wielded it as focus. He coordinated with nurses, held the baby, and provided steady support to Amelia, who leaned on him trembling, exhausted, broken, but alive. Minutes became eternity. Every decision, every movement mattered. He had spent years controlling men, fear, and death itself. But here, the stakes were beyond money, influence, or respect. This was life itself. And for the first time, he understood that being truly powerful meant protecting the vulnerable, not crushing the weak, not bending the world to his will. It meant sacrifice, humility, and action. Amelia's tears fell freely as she watched him, voice shaking. You came. You didn't leave us. I would never leave you, he said softly, eyes meeting hers, full of remorse and something more, something fragile but resolute. I was a fool. I let pride blind me. Never again. The first twin's monitors stabilized under the focused care of the team. The second twin's vitals remained delicate, but the immediate danger had passed. Lorenzo exhaled slowly, relief mingling with exhaustion. He held the children close, feeling the fragile warmth of life against his chest, a weight that was at once terrifying and sacred. The storm outside began to abate. Rain slowed to a drizzle, the city lights glimmering like jewels against slick asphalt. Inside, the chaos of the hospital still pulsed with urgency, but a fragile calm began to settle over Amelia and Lorenzo. The worst had passed, for now. Amelia leaned against him. Small but steady, tears streaming freely. "They're alive," she whispered. We made it." Lorenzo pressed a kiss to her hair, drenched and damp against his chest. "We did," he murmured, "and I will never let anything happen to them or you again. Not pride, not fear, nothing." For a long moment they remained entwined, the children safe between them, a fragile bubble of survival in a world that had threatened to shatter them. The weight of every mistake, every refusal, every second of delay hung over them, but they were alive. And then a quiet voice cut through the tension. Dr. Venturi, standing at the edge of the room, clipboard in hand, expression grim but resolute. "There's one more thing." Lorenzo tensed immediately. His heart clenched in anticipation of more crisis, more danger. "What is it?" Dr. Venturi's eyes flicked between him and Amelia. "The twins. There's an anomaly. Something genetic, unique. Their survival isn't just miraculous, it's unprecedented. We've never seen markers like these in any neonate. They could survive situations others couldn't, but it also means they will need constant monitoring, specialized care. Their uniqueness comes with risk, potentially life-altering complications." Lorenzo absorbed the words, letting them settle like stones in his chest. Relief and fear intertwined. The children were extraordinary, but extraordinary could mean fragile, could mean challenges beyond anything he had ever imagined. Yet he understood something crucial. He would face it all. He would fight for them, for Amelia, for life itself. He looked down at the twins, their tiny fists curling, their breaths shallow but persistent, and felt an overwhelming surge of responsibility, love, and purpose. He had been blind, reckless, and arrogant, but now he would act differently. Every ounce of power, every instinct, every lesson learned would be used to protect them. Amelia rested her head against his shoulder, finally letting herself breathe, though exhaustion had pulled her to the edge of collapse. You're different," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. I never thought you could." Lorenzo pressed a hand to her cheek, wiping away tears. "I've never needed to be different more than now. You've shown me what truly matters." For the first time in years, he felt something he had rarely allowed himself to feel: vulnerability intertwined with strength. Pride no longer anchored him. It had been replaced by something deeper, a fierce, protective love that would not allow failure again. And yet the world remained unpredictable. The hospital was silent for a moment, the only sound the faint beeping of monitors, the soft sighs of nurses and doctors catching their breath. Lorenzo allowed himself a fleeting smile, a fragile sliver of hope. Then, an abrupt knock at the door, firm, deliberate, and unrelenting. The room tensed instantly. Nurses looked toward the door. Amelia stiffened. Lorenzo's instincts, honed by decades of danger and warfare, screamed a warning. He moved between Amelia and the children, posture rigid, eyes narrowing. A man's voice, deep and authoritative, echoed from the other side. "Lorenzo De Luca, open this door." Lorenzo's pulse quickened. He did not recognize the voice, yet the authority in it was undeniable. It carried a threat he had not anticipated, one that reminded him that even as he had survived, even as he had saved Amelia and the twins, the world he commanded and the enemies he had made still lurked, still waited. Amelia clutched his arm, eyes wide with fear. Who is it?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, voice low. "But I intend to find out." He stepped toward the door. Coat dripping, fists clenched. The children's tiny forms rested safely against his chest, but the weight of the unknown pressed on him heavier than ever. Every lesson of his life, every battle, every empire, had prepared him for danger, but nothing could prepare him for the delicate balance of life he now held. The knock came again, louder this time, impatient, insistent. The voice called once more. "Lorenzo De Luca, you cannot hide." He took a slow, deep breath, then turned to Amelia. "Stay with them. Keep them safe. I'll handle this." She nodded, trust mingling with fear, and he knew that the final reckoning was at hand, not just against the world outside, but against the mistakes, the pride, and the arrogance that had nearly cost them everything. He placed the children safely in the incubators, hovering close, and moved to the door. Every step was measured, deliberate, every instinct on high alert. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glimmering like black glass, reflecting the storm of his own conscience. He placed a hand on the doorknob. His pulse thundered in his ears. Every muscle tightened. Every shadow could conceal a threat. And as he opened the door, the light from the corridor illuminated a figure, tall, imposing, and undeniably dangerous. The man stepped forward, eyes locked on Lorenzo, and spoke, voice like gravel and steel. "De Luca, you've made powerful enemies, and now one of them wants what's yours." Lorenzo's grip on the door tightened, teeth grinding. For the first time in years, he felt the world as fragile as the life of his children. He had survived empires, wars, betrayals, but the stakes now were infinitely higher. He glanced back at Amelia, at the twins, the small forms so impossibly delicate, and felt a determination that was absolute. "They are under my protection," he said, voice low and unwavering. "No one touches them. No one touches her." The man smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of lips. "We'll see, De Luca. We'll see." And with that, the door clicked shut behind him, leaving Lorenzo in the corridor, chest heaving, mind racing, and the future uncertain. But for the first time, he knew what he would fight for, and that nothing, no pride, no fear, no enemy, would stop him. Inside the hospital, Amelia looked at the twins, fragile and miraculous, and whispered, "We made it. We survived." But outside, the shadows were gathering, and Lorenzo knew that the reckoning had only just begun.